questions pertaining to the topic. So since we're on the same part, we're going to start with you again, Daniel.
Oh, good.
The second part, and a couple of you touched on it a little bit, but what role does our federal tax policy play in restoring our economy, and what specific tax policy revisions do you plan to advance going forward?
Well, yeah, that's a perfect question, and it's a nice segue from the original one. So a couple of things. One is we need to repeal the death tax. The death tax is an absolutely absurd idea, and the people it hurts the most actually are not the sort of Paris Hilton types that everybody would like to sort of stick it to, but ultimately what it hurts is family farmers who tend to have a lot of money tied up in land, but then if they die, they don't have enough liquidity to pay the 30 or 40% death tax, whatever it is, and so those farms have to be broken up. So that's a terrible disaster. So we need to fix that. Number two is we need to go to a flat tax or a fair tax is not probably electorally possible right now, but we need to go to as flat of a tax as possible, because there's no reason that because you're successful, your 100,000 in first dollar should be taxed at confiscatory rates compared to your 1,000 in first dollar. So we need to go to a flat and as flat as possible income tax across the board. And then ultimately, we need to do something that I've been advocating for a long time, which is shrink the doggone federal government. There are only a couple things that the federal government is supposed to do under the Constitution. It's supposed to provide for the common defense. It's supposed to promote the general welfare. It's supposed to protect property rights. It's supposed to protect individual liberty. And beyond that, not much left. And so what we need to do is get back to a place where the government is not ultimately overspending so much, so that people can keep more of their tax dollars in their pockets. Another thing we need to do is we need to look at what other countries are doing. It's called the Celtic miracle from about 10, 12 years ago, where the Irish cut their corporate tax rate from like 35% to 15%, and all of a sudden had this blow up of economic opportunity in that country. And so we need to do something similar to that. We need to keep our corporate tax rates low so that companies feel comfortable living, working here with the most productive, fruitful workers in the world, which is what we have.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'm next.
Tom?
Right? Yeah.
Tom, we're at you now.
Yeah, so absolutely right. The standard Republican response to fixing the problem, reduce the bureaucracy, deregulate, cut taxes, all those things they remain true today. They've always been true. The corporate tax cut that the president got through has had probably the largest single effect on the economy. I think that the other part that's missing from that is the growth of human capital in the country. And that goes back to where are we spending our money, which is sort of what Elise has hit on. Where are we spending our money? Are we investing it in human capital and essentially growing our brain power in the United States? Okay, Daniel hit on the death tax. It's been a wrong tax since it was implemented. It's never been right. The problem is we can never get enough rhino Republicans to go with this thing because they're all feeding at the food bowl in the bureaucracy. Okay, that's why we've got to be on the lookout for Republicans in name only who say all this stuff about deregulation and cutting taxes and flat taxes and all this stuff, and then they get into office and then they don't actually fulfill what the promises were that they said they were going to do. Okay, I'm with Trump on this. Everything that the president has done, he's done with headwinds from both parties. Okay, he needs allies in the Senate that are going to help him get these things accomplished. Okay, clearly the Republican talking points remain the same: deregulation, lower taxes, improve business. The thing I would add to that is we've got to grow our human capital. We have to re-envision America in the way that I believe Donald Trump is doing with regard to like Space Force, et cetera, to build a STEM double M technology in the infrastructure in the United States that we don't have. We're relying on cheap labor from outside, whether it's H-1B visas or low labor or low human capital labor from South America. So that's why
Okay.
immigration, education are critical to our economy.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Elisa, we're back to you now.
Great. Excuse me. So we absolutely need to make some changes with our federal tax policy. And I've been doing a lot of reading because I don't pretend to be an expert on all things government, just the Constitution from a very relatable standpoint. And so we must have revisions, and I've been doing a lot of reading in particular about the fair tax as a way to do that, because no one likes taxes, and yet we know that without taxes, our public goods and services that are constitutionally provisioned are not going to have the cost covered. So we have to be realist with our approach to federal tax reform. And, you know, pardon me if I sound like a Republican, but I am. And I am a proud Republican seeking the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. And unlike Mark Warner, I will be a Republican vote that the president can count on with his federal tax reform policies moving forward once we get Warner out of there. And then I go back to what I said before, decreasing spending, getting rid of the IRS, and making sure that less government involvement is what we have at the end of the day with our pocketbooks, or in gentlemen's case with your wallets, with your checking accounts, with your bank accounts, because everyone works hard for their money and deserves to keep as much of it as possible, to then choose how they spend it in manners that are pleasing to them. And so, again, fair tax is what I'm looking at to research more of, and just enough taxes at the federal government level to accomplish the constitutionally provisioned purposes of government set forth right there in the introductory paragraph known as the preamble. And if you haven't checked it out in a while, there's that famous Schoolhouse Rock song I advocate to my 8th graders and to citizens across the Commonwealth who need a remediation lesson on what it looks like to have good, common sense federal government. Less is more.
Okay, thanks, Elisa.